In the quiet corners of a seemingly ordinary household, a tragedy unfolded that no one could have predicted. 8 children, all born into the same home, all died before their second birthdays. The world knew Claire Harris as a mother, someone who cared for her family, but behind closed doors, her actions would forever change the fate of her children. What led to the loss of these innocent lives? How could a mother who should have been their protector, their guide through life, instead become their greatest threat? The Harris family seemed like the picture of suburban normalcy. Claire, a loving wife and mother, who tirelessly tended to her growing family, looked like someone who would stop at nothing to ensure the safety and happiness of her children. Her husband, Mark, a steady, hard-working man, supported their home. Together, they raised their children with the hope of a bright future. Yet, beneath this facade of happiness, the horrifying truth began to unravel, one life at a time. From the moment Claire gave birth to her first child, it seemed as though their family was destined for joy. But as more children were born, the joy became overshadowed by increasingly strange, unsettling events. At first, it was small things. A child who never seemed to thrive, then another who seemed constantly sick. But soon, it was too much to ignore the deaths of the children, one after another, each before their second birthday. The medical professionals called it tragic, heartbreaking accidents, nothing more. A case of bad luck, they thought. How could anyone possibly question a mother's love for her own children? But as the years passed and more children died, questions began to swirl. How could so many children, so young and full of potential, die in such a short span of time? How could the mother, the one who was supposed to care for them, protect them, nurture them, become a silent spectator in the loss of her own flesh and blood? How could someone whose very existence should have been dedicated to ensuring their survival, end up being the one who caused their death? Was it simply the result of terrible misfortune, or was there something more deeply sinister, something hidden beneath the surface, that no one had yet discovered? The authorities never suspected anything at first. It seemed almost impossible to fathom that Claire, the mother of 8 children, could be responsible for their deaths. But as time passed and more children were lost, the pattern became undeniable. What was it about Claire that made her the center of this dark tragedy? Why did the truth lie buried beneath layers of grief and denial, waiting for the right moment to surface? This case is one of haunting confusion, a mother's quiet desperation, and an investigation that unraveled secrets far darker than anyone could have imagined. What led Claire to this point? Was there more to these deaths than anyone was willing to admit? Or were they the result of a mother's overwhelming burden finally reaching a breaking point? In today's story, we will unpack the painful truth of what happened in that home. We will take you step by step through the emotional collapse of a mother who had everything to lose and yet lost it all. As we go deeper into this tragic case, you'll discover how the investigation unraveled Claire's carefully constructed world, and how the truth, once revealed, sent shockwaves through her family, her community, and the world. What was Claire's true motive, and why did it take so long for anyone to connect the dots? What went wrong in her mind, and what was the true cost of those mistakes? Was she simply overwhelmed, or was there something darker at play, a darkness that no one could have seen until it was too late? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling truth of Claire Harris, a mother whose lies would echo through the lives of her family for generations, a story that raises deep questions about love, guilt, and the terrible price of a broken mind. This is the story of a mother who failed to protect her children not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. And it's a tragedy that no one will ever forget. Claire had always dreamed of a family, a life full of laughter, love, and the promise of watching her children grow up in a safe, nurturing environment. Like many young women, she envisioned motherhood as a journey of joy, fulfillment, and love. But what she hadn't prepared for was the relentless weight of responsibility, the exhaustion that would eventually wear her down, and the deep, gnawing sense of isolation that crept into every corner of her life. The first few years were manageable barely, but as her family grew, so did the pressure. Each child added to the strain, and Claire, once full of hope, began to feel like a woman stretched too thin, a mother too overwhelmed to cope with what was happening around her. As the years passed, Claire's dream of being the perfect mother slowly crumbled beneath the mounting weight of her own fears, anxieties, and, perhaps, a deep sadness she could never escape. The laughter of children in the house was replaced with the quiet echo of frustration, and what was once a vibrant, bustling home became a place where silence ruled. There were no more moments of peace, no reprieve from the endless demands of motherhood. Claire found herself retreating into herself, unable to connect with the children she once adored. She no longer felt the deep joy that motherhood had promised her. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Was motherhood too much for Claire to handle? Or had the burden become something that no one could fully comprehend? Was it the exhaustion of caring for multiple children, each with their own needs and desires, that drove her to a breaking point? Or was there something else, something Claire couldn't bring herself to acknowledge, something buried too deep to confront? It was the loss of her second child that marked the beginning of a long and painful unraveling. Little Emily's death was ruled a tragic accident, just like the others before her, but the way Claire responded in the wake of the tragedy sent chills through those around her. Everyone expected grief, despair, perhaps even disbelief, but instead, Claire remained calm. Too calm. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even seem to flinch. It was as if the loss of a child, a life so precious and fragile, meant nothing to her. To her family, to the doctors, to the neighbors who had watched her for years, Claire's reaction was deeply unsettling. In the days that followed Emily's death, those closest to Claire couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was off. The grief they expected from a mother who had just lost her child was absent, replaced with a cold, controlled demeanor that was, to say the least, unnerving. The rest of the family, especially Mark, Claire's husband, struggled to make sense of her actions. How could a mother who had been so devoted to her children, so involved in their lives, suddenly become so detached from the reality of her grief? But it wasn't just the absence of grief that worried them, it was the small details, the subtle shifts in Claire's behavior. There were reports of her being unusually quiet, her eyes often distant, her movements slow, almost robotic. It was as though Claire was physically present, but mentally, emotionally, she had already checked out. For those closest to her, it was hard to tell whether she was simply overwhelmed or whether something had changed in her, something that no one could quite pinpoint. Over time, suspicion began to take root, although no one could articulate why. Was it simply the strain of motherhood? Was she suffering from postpartum depression, a condition that affects many women after childbirth? Or was there something more, a dark secret buried beneath her calm exterior that no one had yet uncovered? For the next few months, Claire's behavior continued to raise more questions than answers. She seemed to move through her days in a fog, each one blending into the next. When another child, her third, died unexpectedly, the shock felt less like an isolated incident and more like the unfolding of a tragic pattern. The family was shaken, but not in the way they had been before. This time, the disbelief didn't come with the same outpouring of tears and cries of loss. Instead, there was a cold silence that filled the room. Claire remained distant, removed, as though she were an observer in her own life. Her calmness in the face of so much loss struck everyone as strange. Could a mother who had just lost her third child really feel nothing? Could she truly be so unaffected by the deaths of her own flesh and blood? As these questions lingered, the unspoken suspicion grew, but it wasn't enough for anyone to voice it aloud. There was no evidence, no proof, just a creeping sense that something was terribly wrong. But it wasn't until a fourth child died, in a manner that mirrored the deaths of the others, that the pieces began to come together. This time, the investigation was different. The coroner's office was asked to examine the bodies more closely. The police began to ask questions that had gone unasked before. How could so many children from the same family die under similar circumstances, so young, so tragically? And why was Claire's demeanor, in every instance of loss, so unnervingly composed? In that moment, everything changed. The deaths, once dismissed as tragic accidents, were now under scrutiny. The calmness that Claire had exhibited in the face of each loss could no longer be ignored. It became the key that would unlock a door that no one wanted to open. For Claire, however, it was too late. The suspicion that had been quietly building for months had turned into something far more dangerous, an investigation that would bring everything she had carefully hidden to light. The truth, it seemed, was not just a series of unfortunate events, it was something much more complex, much darker, than anyone could have anticipated. The question that would soon consume everyone involved was no longer just about how these children died, it was about why. Why had Claire, the mother who was supposed to love and protect her children, become the very source of their death? What had happened to her, and what had been hidden beneath the surface all these years? As the investigation unfolded, more questions arose. Was Claire truly the one responsible, or had her mind become so fractured that she couldn't even see the horror of what she was doing? And how many others, how many mothers were silently suffering, carrying the weight of their darkest fears, without anyone ever realizing the danger they posed? The truth would soon be uncovered, and it would shake everyone to the core. But by then, it would be far too late for the children who had already paid the price. And for Claire, the consequences would be nothing short of catastrophic. When little Ben died, no one expected what would follow. His death seemed like the tragic continuation of a pattern that had already claimed two of his older siblings. At first, there was nothing remarkable about his passing, another unexplained infant death, another family left to mourn. But this time, there was a difference. This time, people were watching Claire, and her reaction, or rather, her lack of one, set off a storm of questions that no one could ignore. The calmness in her eyes, the unbroken composure, was enough to make anyone uneasy. The grief that should have overtaken a mother in the wake of her child's death wasn't there. Instead, Claire went about the funeral arrangements with an unsettling efficiency. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She barely seemed to feel. And for the first time, the authorities began to look at her differently. As the case of little Ben's death was investigated, Claire's past began to draw attention. It was as if her very presence in the room left behind a cold, unshakable doubt. Neighbors, family, and even close friends recalled her strange detachment after each of the children's deaths. No tears. No breakdowns. Just silence. It wasn't long before the police received an anonymous tip-off, the first small crack in the wall of normalcy Claire had so carefully maintained. For months, authorities had dismissed the deaths of Claire's children as a series of tragic accidents. After all, the deaths of infants, particularly in large families, could sometimes be attributed to natural causes, health complications, or, as some thought, simply bad luck. But Detective Anderson, a seasoned investigator, had been working on the case from the beginning, and something didn't sit right. He couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. As the third child died in similar circumstances, the idea of coincidence seemed less plausible. Detective Anderson was no stranger to tragedy. He had seen it before: families shattered, lives lost. But this felt different. Each child seemed to have fallen ill in the same way, showing similar signs of fatigue, lethargy, and unexplained sickness before they died. And despite their young ages, they had all seemed unusually fragile. Could one family truly experience this level of misfortune? Could this many children be so sickly, so prone to death? How could Claire, a mother who loved her children at least, that's what everyone believed, become a passive observer in their deaths? And yet, there was no evidence of foul play, nothing definitive that would lead the investigators to believe otherwise. Claire was still the grieving mother, the woman who had lost more than any mother should. But Detective Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, some detail that had been overlooked. His intuition told him that these deaths, so eerily similar in their timing and manner, were not the result of random tragedy. There had to be a reason. There had to be a link between them. And if Claire was involved in some way, then it would be up to him to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. The investigation continued to dig deeper into Claire's life and background. What they found was a family history filled with pain, loss, and unspoken truths. Medical records revealed startling similarities in the causes of death: multiple cases of unexplained fever, sudden weight loss, and a disturbing trend of infants who failed to thrive. It wasn't just the deaths themselves that were strange, it was how quickly Claire seemed to move on from them. After each child passed, she would retreat into herself for a brief period, but soon enough, she would resume her daily life as if nothing had happened. Her ability to compartmentalize her grief was something that struck everyone around her as unusual. Could it be that Claire's own mental state had deteriorated to the point where she had become numb to the world around her? Or was there something more troubling at play? As Detective Anderson and his team continued their investigation, they began to interview doctors, family members, and even neighbors who had seen Claire in the months and years leading up to the deaths. Some spoke of her growing distance from her children, the way she sometimes spoke about them in a detached manner, almost as though they were burdens instead of gifts. But these were small pieces, bits of the puzzle that didn't fully come together until they started digging into the medical records. Their breakthrough came when they spoke to the pediatrician who had treated Claire's children over the years. He revealed a disturbing piece of information: all of the children had been prescribed a common medication, one that Claire had obtained through various doctors. It was a medication used to treat a wide range of conditions, including fever, pain, and inflammation. But what no one knew, what no one had thought to check until now, was that the doses Claire had been giving her children were dangerously high enough to cause damage to their fragile systems. How had she managed to convince multiple doctors to prescribe these drugs, and why had they never questioned the frequency or dosage? As the pieces slowly started to fall into place, Detective Anderson's suspicion grew. What had started as a case of unexplained infant deaths was now turning into something far more calculated. Claire hadn't just been an unwilling participant in these tragedies, she had been the orchestrator. It wasn't just the medication, but her behavior, the way she controlled the children's environments, and the increasing number of reports from neighbors about her strange interactions with them. The evidence was mounting, and Anderson knew that they were on the verge of something far more horrific than they had initially realized. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Claire's involvement in the deaths of her children went beyond mere neglect or accidental circumstances. She had, in fact, been responsible for their suffering, whether consciously or not. The investigation had revealed a pattern in her actions, one that had been buried beneath layers of grief, denial, and a mother's instinct to protect her family. But at the heart of it all was a woman who had become too detached from her own reality, too removed from the very thing she was supposed to cherish most. And then, one day, the breakthrough came. A medical examiner's report confirmed what had only been a suspicion before: traces of the medication Claire had been administering were found in the children's systems at lethal levels. The evidence was irrefutable. Claire, the woman who was supposed to love and protect her children, had been the one who caused their deaths. But why? Why had she done it? The truth was more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. As Claire sat in the interrogation room, facing Detective Anderson and the rest of the team, her expression remained unreadable. She would later confess to everything, but not in the way they had expected. Her motive was not the cold, calculated desire to hurt her children, but the result of a mind undone by years of overwhelming pressure. Claire had been consumed by a dark and twisted belief that her children's deaths would somehow bring peace to her fractured family, a twisted, misguided solution to the pain she had carried with her for so long. The truth was out, but the damage had been done. Claire Harris would face the consequences for her actions, but the true cost of her actions was far more than anyone could comprehend. At this point, you've heard the details: the strange pattern of deaths, Claire's behavior, the unsettling calmness in the face of overwhelming grief. The questions begin to multiply. Could Claire's actions simply be the result of a psychological breakdown, a mother who had been pushed to the edge by the weight of her responsibilities, overwhelmed by the constant demands of raising a family? Or was there something more calculated at play? Did Claire have a hidden agenda from the very beginning? Was her detachment and strange calmness a mask she wore to hide her true intentions? The pieces of the puzzle are beginning to fit together, but we still don't have the full picture. Could there have been something deeper, something Claire herself didn't understand about her own mind? Or was this an act of deliberate cruelty, an attempt to gain control over a life she could no longer manage? At this moment, the answer seems just out of reach, and the truth could be far more complex than anyone imagined. What do you think? Was Claire driven by a mental breakdown, or was her behavior the result of something much darker? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'll return to that question shortly. But just when it seemed like the investigation was getting closer to the truth, something shocking emerged: new revelations that no one could have predicted. As the authorities gathered evidence, they unearthed details that raised even more questions. These weren't just ordinary findings, these were pieces of the puzzle that threatened to reshape everything investigators thought they knew about Claire and the deaths of her children. As more of Claire's personal life came into focus, startling information came to light. Behind her seemingly perfect family facade, Claire had been hiding things far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just the medication she had been using, or the disturbing pattern of behavior, it was what had been happening in the background. There were secrets in her past that began to surface, secrets that suggested Claire had been dealing with far more than just the pressures of motherhood. But what exactly had she been hiding? And how much of this was a carefully crafted act to mislead everyone around her? You won't believe what was uncovered. The more they dug, the more layers they peeled back. Claire had been hiding a past full of hidden trauma, emotional scars, and unresolved issues that stretched back years. The investigation into her children's deaths was just the beginning. The true story was far more complex, and the secrets Claire had kept buried for so long were now threatening to unravel in a way that no one could have prepared for. Stay with us as we reveal more of what Claire had been hiding and how the shocking truth turned the case on its head. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Just when investigators thought they had Claire cornered, just when it seemed like they had all the evidence they needed to charge her, a surprising twist threatened to change everything they thought they knew about the case. The truth they had been piecing together for months was suddenly thrown into doubt. Claire's calm demeanor, which had once seemed so chilling, suddenly took on a different meaning. It was a confession, but not the confession everyone had been expecting. Claire admitted to the deaths of her children, but her explanation shocked everyone in the room. She didn't try to justify her actions, nor did she express any remorse for what she had done. Instead, she claimed that she had been trying to save her children from a life of suffering, that she had done what she believed was best for them. Her reasoning, however flawed, threw investigators into disarray. Was Claire really guilty of murder, or had she convinced herself that she was doing something noble? Was she simply a victim of her own mind, caught in a delusion so deep that she could no longer distinguish right from wrong? At this moment, everything about the case shifted. Was Claire a cold-blooded killer, or had she truly lost touch with reality? What had seemed like a straightforward investigation now became a labyrinth of moral ambiguity and psychological complexity. And the most shocking revelation of all? Claire's state of mind wasn't as clear-cut as anyone had hoped. Some experts believed she had acted out of an unconscious drive to protect her family, while others insisted that she was fully aware of her actions and should be held accountable. As the clock ticked on, it became clear that this wasn't going to be an easy case to solve. The deeper the investigation went, the more questions emerged. Was Claire a victim of her own psyche, or was she a manipulative criminal who knew exactly what she was doing? And would the authorities be able to prove the truth, no matter how complex or twisted it might be? As we leave Claire's fate hanging in the balance, the questions linger. Was she really guilty of the deaths of her children, or was she merely a casualty of her own unraveling mind? Stick around as we explore the psychological and legal battles that followed, and see how this case full of shocking twists and emotional turmoil came to an unexpected conclusion. Claire's mind had become a labyrinth of guilt, confusion, and overwhelming fear. The world around her seemed to close in, becoming smaller and more oppressive with every passing day. How had this mother, who once held such dreams of nurturing and loving her children, come to this? How could someone who had once wanted nothing more than to be a good mother, to provide safety and warmth, be responsible for the deaths of 8 innocent lives? As the investigation dug deeper, Claire's inner turmoil began to unfold, revealing a woman whose mental state had deteriorated over years of isolation and emotional strain. It wasn't just the exhaustion from raising so many children, though, that, in itself, had been a heavy burden. It was the weight of expectations, the never-ending demands of motherhood that pushed her to the edge. With each child, Claire had hoped for relief, for a moment where the chaos would settle, where she could find peace in the demands of daily life. But peace never came. Instead, there was always more to do, always another mouth to feed, another tantrum to soothe, another child to care for. As the years wore on, Claire found herself unable to escape the crushing weight of her responsibilities. There was no moment of respite, no space for her own thoughts, her own needs. Her husband, though present, was often absent emotionally, busy with his work and unaware of the strain Claire was under. She felt invisible in her own home, as though she were simply a vessel for the endless work of motherhood. As the deaths began, Claire began to retreat further into herself, distancing herself from her family, from her own children. She no longer felt the connection she once had with them. The love she had once given so freely seemed to slip away, leaving her with nothing but a constant, gnawing emptiness. But how could a mother who had once adored her children, who had nurtured them with the hopes of seeing them grow into adults, come to see them as a burden? How could she justify their deaths, believing they were somehow better off gone? The answer, though complex, was buried deep within the tangled mess of her emotions. Her mind had, over time, become fractured, unable to reconcile the demands of motherhood with her own sense of self-worth. The guilt, the shame, the fear, it all accumulated until it became too much to bear. Claire was drowning in it, unable to see a way out. The more she tried to manage, the more she felt like a failure, like a woman who was constantly falling short of what was expected of her. The overwhelming exhaustion, the isolation, and the relentless pressure had all taken their toll. Claire felt as though she were disappearing, losing herself in the role she was expected to play: mother, wife, caregiver. But in this loss of self, she began to create a version of reality in which her children were better off gone. She convinced herself that her children would never experience true happiness, that they would always be plagued by sickness and suffering. In her mind, the only way to stop their suffering and her own was to take their lives, to free them from the world they could never fully thrive in. It was this warped logic that would eventually lead her down the path to destruction, a path that seemed impossible to turn back from once it had begun. As Claire sat in the interrogation room, her confession began to unravel, piece by piece, a narrative that was as difficult to understand as it was chilling. She spoke in a flat tone, her words measured, almost as though she were recounting a story that didn't belong to her. The authorities had already heard the details: the multiple deaths, the strange behavior, the increasing isolation. But now, they needed to understand why. What had driven Claire to kill her children? Was this the act of a woman whose mind had fractured beyond repair, or was there a deeper, more complicated motive hiding beneath her words? Claire's confession began not with regret or remorse, but with a statement that stunned the detectives in the room. They were better off, she said simply. They were suffering. I was suffering. It was the only way. Detective Anderson was taken aback by the calmness in her voice. It wasn't what he had expected. There was no anger, no guilt, no relief. Just the quiet, rational explanation of a woman who had, in her mind, made the right choice. Claire had believed that her children were doomed to a life of suffering, that the illness and fragility that had plagued them would only get worse. And in her eyes, death was the only release from that suffering. To her, it wasn't murder, it was mercy. But as the detectives continued to press her, more layers began to peel back. Claire explained how, over the years, she had watched her children grow weaker and more ill, how she had felt helpless in the face of their constant sickness. It had worn her down emotionally, physically, mentally. Her mind, she claimed, had begun to twist the reality of her situation into something she could manage, something she could control. The more she struggled, the more her mind sought a solution to the pain, and in her distorted perception of reality, the only solution was to end their lives. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't about hatred. It was about saving them from a future they could never have. Her voice became colder as she continued, recounting the months leading up to the deaths. She spoke of her attempts to make her children comfortable, to care for them as best as she could, but in the back of her mind, she knew that no matter how much love she gave them, they would never be normal. Her children were sick, she told them. They were frail, unable to survive in a world that was too harsh for them. And in her twisted logic, the only way to release them from their suffering was to take their lives. It was an act of love, she convinced herself. An act of mercy. As the confession continued, it became clear that Claire had not been driven by anger, but by a delusion of belief that her actions were justified, even necessary. The chilling part was not that she had believed it, but that she had convinced herself over time that it was the only way to help. What had started as exhaustion, as a slow breakdown of her own mental health, had eventually morphed into a full-fledged justification for murder. And in her mind, she wasn't a killer, she was a savior, a mother who had made the ultimate sacrifice for her children's sake. But could this truly be the result of a psychological breakdown, or was there something else at play? Was Claire truly out of her mind, or was she simply a woman who had lost touch with reality in the most tragic way possible? As the investigation continued, the line between sanity and madness blurred, and the authorities were left with more questions than answers. Was Claire simply broken, or was there something more behind her actions, something that even she couldn't comprehend? As Claire's trial approached, the investigation reached its boiling point. What had once been dismissed as a series of unfortunate accidents was now undeniably a case of deliberate murder. The wheels of justice began to turn, but the further investigators dug, the more they realized just how twisted the truth was. Claire's calm demeanor and seemingly rational justifications were now contrasted against the mounting evidence of premeditation, of actions carried out with a chilling sense of detachment. What had seemed like a string of tragic events, a series of deaths that simply couldn't be explained, was now clearly a case of murder, one that had been carried out methodically, with a cold and calculated resolve. As the evidence piled up, the true horror of what had happened to these innocent children began to emerge. The deaths had not been accidents. They had not been the result of some random misfortune or an unfortunate string of illnesses. They were carefully planned, and in Claire's mind, they were justified. The authorities now understood that Claire had, in her own mind, believed she was saving her children from a life of suffering. But the reality of what she had done, the cold, deliberate actions that led to their deaths, was far more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. The case, once seen as a tragic mystery, now stood as one of the most chilling examples of maternal filicide. The prosecution had gathered a mountain of evidence, medical reports showing the high doses of medication Claire had administered to her children, witness statements from doctors who questioned her behavior, and Claire's own confession. But what they couldn't account for, what no one could truly understand, was how a mother who should have nurtured her children, protected them from harm, had instead taken their lives. What had happened to Claire? How had she fallen so far into the darkness that she could justify murder as an act of mercy? The media coverage of the trial was intense, with public opinion divided. Some saw Claire as a broken woman, someone who had simply lost touch with reality. Others saw her as a cold-blooded murderer who deserved to pay for her actions. The families of the victims, those who had loved the children Claire had killed, were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered world. No one could truly understand what had driven Claire to this point. No one could explain how a mother could lose so much of herself, so completely, that she could turn on her own flesh and blood. The trial began with the prosecution laying out a detailed timeline of the children's deaths, each one following a disturbingly similar pattern. They presented evidence of Claire's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to each death, her strange detachment, her lack of emotion, her insistence that her children were sickly, fragile, and destined to die young. They showed how she had slowly and methodically administered the fatal doses of medication, convinced that each child's suffering was inevitable. The defense, on the other hand, struggled to argue that Claire had acted out of some twisted form of love. Her actions, they claimed, were the result of a broken mind, one that had become so consumed by guilt and fear that she no longer understood the weight of her actions. Inside the interrogation room, Claire sat alone, her eyes distant, as though she were somewhere else entirely. The room was quiet except for the sound of her soft breathing. She had been asked countless times to recount the events leading up to each of her children's deaths, but every time she spoke, her voice seemed to lose its edge, as if the weight of the truth had drained her of emotion. She no longer seemed capable of fully processing what she had done. Claire's mind wandered back to the moments when each child died. In her mind, the images played out like a haunting slideshow, each one so vivid, so sharp, yet emotionally distant. The first child, Lucas, a small, fragile boy who had always seemed so sickly, so frail. She remembered the day he died, the way his small body had felt so limp in her arms, his eyes dull and lifeless. Claire hadn't cried then. She hadn't cried when he took his last breath, either. Instead, she had held him, staring at him as if trying to absorb the reality of what had just happened. Was this her fault? Had she known what she was doing? Was it possible that she had failed him in a way that could never be undone? Then, there was Lily. She had been the youngest, the most fragile. Her death had followed the same pattern as the others. Claire had been there, alone in the room, watching her struggle for breath, watching her slowly fade away. The guilt had been heavier then, more suffocating, but there had been no tears, no emotional release. Claire had simply given the child what she believed was necessary, the final dose that would end her suffering. Was it because she believed she was saving them, or was it because she no longer knew how to stop? Each death had been harder than the last, but each time, Claire's mind had found a way to justify it. In her twisted reasoning, the children were better off. They would never be strong enough, never be healthy enough to survive in a world that seemed so cruel. She had convinced herself that they were better off dead than to live in pain, to suffer from illnesses that would always return. And in her mind, she was doing them a favor. She was protecting them. She was saving them. But as she sat in that small, sterile room, Claire began to realize just how far her mind had wandered from reality. She had never really seen the damage she had done, had never fully understood what her actions meant. The overwhelming weight of guilt began to settle on her shoulders as the memories of each child's death washed over her. Was she truly responsible for their deaths? Could she truly justify what she had done? Or had she simply lost control, become so consumed by her own fear and guilt that she no longer knew what was real and what wasn't? As Claire sat there, her mind racing through the images of her children, the sharp, painful truth began to sink in. Her children were gone. And no matter how much she tried to explain it, no matter how much she tried to rationalize her actions, they would never come back. The overwhelming realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her, and for the first time in years, Claire felt the full force of what she had done. But even as the weight of her actions bore down on her, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She had done what she had believed was best for them, and no amount of time, no amount of guilt, would ever change that. After months of legal battles, the truth of Claire's actions became undeniable. The evidence against her was overwhelming: the toxic doses of medication found in the children's systems, the testimony from medical experts who confirmed the lethal dosages, the chilling confession she had made to investigators, and the unsettling lack of remorse in her demeanor. In the eyes of the law, Claire Harris was convicted of all 8 murders, but as the verdict was read, there remained a cloud of uncertainty that hung over the case. Could a mother who had once loved her children, who had raised them with care, truly be capable of such monstrous acts? The courtroom was divided. Some argued that Claire was a victim of severe mental illness, someone whose mind had fractured under the crushing weight of motherhood, isolation, and guilt. They contended that she had lost touch with reality, unable to distinguish right from wrong by the time she carried out the killings. Others saw her actions as cold and calculated, a mother who, in her delusion, had turned murder into a form of mercy. The court ruled that Claire was mentally unfit to stand trial, fully accountable. She was sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility, where she would receive treatment for her condition. But no matter the verdict, the damage was done. The children were gone, their lives snuffed out before they had a chance to grow. And for those who were left behind, the husband, the extended family, the community, the devastation was profound. The guilt of the family members, who had watched Claire's growing detachment and never questioned it, the pain of losing 8 innocent children in such a tragic way, was something that would never truly heal. And even as Claire's fate was sealed, the questions lingered. Could they have seen the signs earlier? Could they have prevented the deaths? And perhaps the most haunting question of all: what exactly was it that had driven Claire to such a heartbreaking conclusion? In the end, the Harris family was torn apart not just by Claire's actions, but by the deep, irreparable betrayal of a mother. A mother who was supposed to be the one to protect her children, to nurture them, to guide them through the world with love and care, had become their executioner. The bond between mother and child, the most sacred of connections, had been shattered beyond repair. The death of each child, under Claire's own roof, left scars that no legal ruling could ever undo. Her husband, Mark, was left grappling with the dual weight of loss and betrayal. He had believed, like everyone else, that Claire was the loving mother she had once been. And yet, as the truth came to light, he found himself questioning everything about their life together, about their family. How could he have missed the signs? Was he complicit in this tragedy, simply by turning a blind eye to the changes in Claire's behavior? The families of the children who had been lost were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They were forced to confront the painful truth that the person they had trusted the most, the one person they thought would never harm their children, had taken them away in the most unimaginable way. Their grief would never truly end. No matter how long it took, no matter what happened to Claire, the ache of losing their loved ones would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this tragedy was the question it left behind: how do we protect those who can't protect themselves from the very ones who should love them the most? How do we ensure that the most vulnerable, the innocent lives that depend on their caregivers for survival, aren't subjected to such betrayal? The failure to protect these children raises uncomfortable questions about trust, mental health, and the often invisible fractures that can form within a family. Could more have been done? Could someone have intervened sooner? As you reflect on this tragic case, what do you think? Was Claire a victim of her own mind, driven to the edge by years of overwhelming pressure and mental illness? Or was she a cold-blooded murderer who simply justified her actions in the name of mercy? Was she truly out of control, or did she choose, in her broken state, to take the lives of her children? The truth is complex, and the line between guilt and innocence often isn't as clear as it seems. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Was Claire simply a woman who had lost her way, or was she fully aware of the horror she was committing? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more shocking true crime stories. Stay tuned for our next case.